Something happened a long time ago that most people were never supposed to find out about. But right now, in university archives, in climate-controlled museum vaults, in the dusty corners of Vatican libraries, there are ancient texts, texts that were once considered scripture, texts that the earliest followers of the way read, passed around, wept over, and died protecting. And those same texts were later declared forbidden, not because they were false, but because of what they said, because of who they said you really are. If you have ever looked at the Bible and felt like something was missing, if you have ever read a passage and sensed a deeper layer underneath it, something the footnotes never explain, then what I am about to tell you will not surprise you. It will confirm what you already felt. So here is the question that has been burning since the first councils gathered behind closed doors. Did they remove books from the sacred text on purpose? And if so, what were those books trying to tell us? Let us go back to the 1st and 2nd centuries after the life and teaching of Yeshua, the one called Jesus. In those early days, there was no single Christianity. There were communities, scattered across Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Rome, each one preserving its own memories of the teacher, each one holding its own collection of writings. The community in Alexandria read texts that the community in Antioch had never heard of. The community in Rome was already beginning to consolidate power. And across the ancient world, seekers like you were gathering in hidden rooms, passing around papyrus scrolls, and asking questions that the emerging hierarchy did not want asked. Questions like, who is the God of this world, and is he the same as the Most High? Why is there suffering if the Creator is good? What did Yeshua mean when he said the kingdom is within you? What did he tell his disciples in private? Those questions had answers, written answers, answers that were being read before the councils ever met. And that is where our story really begins. The process of deciding the official Bible did not happen in one meeting. It unfolded over centuries, but there were key moments, key councils where men in power voted. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea was convened by the Emperor Constantine, not a prophet, a Roman emperor, a man who needed a unified religion to hold together a fracturing empire. It was policy dressed in sacred language. Certain texts were ratified, others were banned. And then in 367 CE, a bishop named Athanasius wrote a letter. In that letter, he listed, for the first time, the 27 books of what we now call the New Testament. Everything else, he said, was to be rejected, destroyed. But here is what you need to understand about what he was trying to destroy. He was not burning fairy tales. He was not silencing confused minds. He was targeting a body of spiritual knowledge so deep, so precise in its description of the inner world, that the institution could not survive if the average person had access to it. Because that knowledge did not point outward, to a priest, to a hierarchy, to a mediator you had to pay for. It pointed inward, to a spark, a divine inheritance buried inside every human soul. And that is dangerous to anyone whose power depends on keeping you afraid, dependent, and obedient. Now, if you are new to this channel, this is the kind of territory we explore every single week on the Gnostic Archive. Ancient texts, hidden teachings, the esoteric layer of scripture that was never meant to be removed. If this is resonating with you, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Because what is coming next in this particular story is something that will completely shift how you read scripture. In 1945, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging near a cliff face in Upper Egypt. He was looking for fertilizer soil. What he found instead was a sealed earthenware jar. Inside that jar, 52 texts, texts that had been buried around the same time Athanasius wrote his letter, Someone, somewhere in the 4th century, had chosen to save them rather than burn them. They buried them in the desert, waiting for a time when the world might be ready. The Nag Hammadi library contained texts like the Gospel of Thomas. These were the spiritual writings of entire communities, entire lineages of seekers. Let us sit with one of them, the Gospel of Thomas. No miracles, no crucifixion story, no resurrection narrative, just 114 sayings. And it opens with, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." Not whoever joins the correct institution, whoever discovers the interpretation, whoever does the inner work, whoever seeks and keeps seeking until the spark within them wakes up. This is a completely different spiritual framework. Not faith in someone else's experience, direct experience of the divine within yourself. That is exactly what the councils voted out. Now let us look at what was also hidden beneath the surface of the Apocryphon of John. This text describes a vision received by John the son of Zebedee after the crucifixion. A vision in which the invisible, perfect, ineffable God, the true source, the monad, reveals to him the actual structure of reality, including the troubling truth about how this world was created. According to that vision, the world you are living in was not made by the highest God. It was made by a lesser being, a being who emerged from a mistake in the heavenly realm, a being who did not fully understand what he was, and who in his ignorance fashioned a world, this world, as a kind of prison, not out of malice, out of blindness. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because if you look around at the suffering, the cycles of violence, the structures of control that seem almost deliberately designed to keep human beings confused and small, you begin to understand why this cosmology was so dangerous to the people in power. Because it names the prison. And once you name the prison, you can begin to look for the door. There is another text that deserves its moment here, the Gospel of Philip. In this text, there is a teaching about the bridal chamber, not a literal room, a metaphor for the inner union, the reunion of the divine spark within you with its source. This teaching points toward the restoration of wholeness within the self, the return to the pleroma, the fullness, the place of completeness from which the spark originally descended. Philip's text also does something remarkable. It describes Mary Magdalene as the companion of Yeshua, the one he loved more than the other disciples, the one he kissed often. Now, many scholars have debated what that means on a physical level. But on a symbolic, esoteric level, the meaning is unmistakable. Mary Magdalene in the Gnostic texts is not a reformed sinner. She is the embodiment of Sophia, divine wisdom. She is the feminine principle of the divine. She is the aspect of the sacred that the institutional church spent centuries suppressing, discrediting, and silencing. Is it a coincidence that the texts which elevate feminine divine wisdom were the same ones voted out of the canon? You decide. And this is a good moment to remind you, if you are finding this valuable, please like this video and share it with someone who is asking these same questions. The algorithm does not always show content like this to the people who need it most. You sharing it is how it finds them. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next episode goes even deeper into what those hidden texts actually say about the inner nature of the human soul. You do not want to miss it. Now let us talk about the text known as the Gospel of Judas. Rediscovered in the 1970s, authenticated in the 2000s. In this text, Judas is not the villain. He is the initiate, the one who truly understands. The only disciple who truly understood what Yeshua was asking him to do. In this telling, Yeshua asks Judas specifically and privately to hand him over, not as a betrayal, as a sacred act, to free the divine spark trapped within the physical body. to complete the mission. Now, whether you receive that as literal history or as spiritual symbolism, the implications are staggering either way. Because if true, the most demonized figure in all of Western religious history was actually the most faithful, and the story the Church has been telling for 2,000 years flips completely on its axis, you see why this text could not be allowed in the canon. It does not just challenge doctrine. It dismantles the entire moral framework the institution was built on. The framework of guilt, of unworthiness, of the sinner who needs the institution to be saved. If Judas is the hero, then shame loses its grip on you, and without shame you cannot be controlled. Let us also speak briefly about the Book of Enoch, ancient, venerated, quoted directly by Jude, one of the books that did make it into the canonical New Testament. The Apostle Jude quotes from Enoch as though it is scripture, which it was for centuries. The Book of Enoch describes in extraordinary detail the nature of the Watchers, non-human intelligences who descended into the material realm and corrupted the original spiritual template of humanity. It describes a cosmology, a map of heavenly realms that aligns almost perfectly with what the Gnostic texts describe. It speaks of a coming judgment not of human beings by God, but of the corrupt powers who have been running this world. The archons, the hidden rulers of the material realm, the ones whose grip loosens every time a human being wakes up. The Book of Enoch was eventually dropped. It survived intact only in Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Everywhere else removed. Now here is something that needs to be said clearly. This is not a conspiracy theory about evil men in a dark room plotting against you. The history is far more interesting and more human than that. What happened was an empire trying to manage a movement that was beautiful, diverse, explosive, and deeply threatening to centralized control. The early church fathers, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, they were not stupid men, they were brilliant, and some of them genuinely believed they were protecting the tradition from confusion. But protection and suppression look identical from the outside, and what they protected against was not confusion. It was direct, unmediated inner experience of the divine. Because a person who has direct experience of the divine within themselves does not need an institution, does not need to pay for access to God, does not need to confess to an intermediary, does not need to be kept afraid in order to attend services. That is what was lost when the canon was closed. Not just information, a technology, a living, breathing technology of inner awakening.
And here is the most uncomfortable truth of all. The people who closed the canon knew this. The suppression was not ignorant. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the 2nd century, in his work against heresies, specifically targets the Gnostic communities. He names them, he mocks them, he accuses them of secret rituals and dangerous ideas. And chief among those dangerous ideas, that the God of the Old Testament, the creator of the material world, is not the same as the ultimate, unknowable, loving Father that Yeshua pointed to. Irenaeus understood that if that idea spread, if the average person began to question whether the God demanding sacrifice and punishment was actually the highest God, the entire theological structure of the emerging institutional church would collapse. So he called it heresy. And heresy in those days eventually became something you could be killed for. But they could not burn everything. Someone in Nag Hammadi hid those jars. Someone in the Egyptian desert chose preservation over obedience, and those 52 texts waited in the dark for 16 centuries, till 1945, until now, until you. So what do we do with all of this? What does it mean for you, sitting here, watching this video, feeling something move in your chest that you cannot quite name? It means that the seeking you have been doing, the restlessness, the sense that the official version of reality is not the whole story, was not confusion. It was intelligence. It was the divine spark within you, pressing against the walls of the narrative that was built to contain it. The texts that were hidden because of what they say about you. Not about God far away in a heaven above the clouds. About the divine nature that lives inside your own awareness. The Gospel of Thomas says it plainly. The kingdom is spread across the earth, and people do not see it. It is inside you, and it is outside you. And when you know yourself, you will be known. When you do not know yourself, you live in poverty, and that poverty is not material. It is spiritual. It is the poverty of not knowing who you really are. This is the final note I want to leave with you today. Because this is not actually a story about the past. It is a story about right now. Every time a person wakes up to the deeper nature of reality. Every time someone steps outside the prescribed story and begins to ask genuine questions, the act of suppression fails a little more. The buried jar gets opened a little wider, and the light that was never supposed to reach you keeps traveling. 16 centuries through desert sand, through translation, all the way to this moment, all the way to you. The texts were buried, but you found them, and more than that, you recognized them. That recognition is not accidental. It never is. The way. If this episode moved something in you, please share it and subscribe to the Gnostic Archive. The next episode goes into the specific teachings of those hidden texts, what they say about the divine spark inside you, and how it wakes up. That episode is one you will want to be here for. We are just getting started.